Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear, the podcast conversation with a changemaker working to accelerate the transition to a sustainable carbon-neutral society. I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. And folks, welcome to 2023. This is our first show of the year. I hope you'll take a few minutes to visit your favorite podcasting site and leave a review of the show. It'll help us reach more people and share these ideas. Today, we want to talk about the urban, rural, and youth elder divisions in society that represent some of the most difficult challenges to having a robust conversation about how to reduce emissions and waste, what we value as a society, and the path to the aforementioned sustainable carbon-neutral society. A just future will be co-designed by all of us. It will take pluralism, and we need to reconnect to move from division to collaboration. I recently read Kuni, a Japanese vision and practice for urban-rural reconnection by Tsuyoshi-Sekihara and Richard McCarthy. Richard joins us today to discuss the book. He's the co-founder of Crescent City Farmers Market in New Orleans and was part of the leadership of the Slow Food USA movement for many years. Kuni is an ancient word in Japanese that means a nation or a small, independent, ancient community. Sekihara developed the modern practice of Kuni when he moved to a village after more than a decade into Tokyo, the largest city in the world. When he came to this village, which was near but not the same village that he grew up in, he found older people living in a dying environment with little support or hope, and decided to develop a democratic governance model for building urban-rural networks of people committed to having egalitarian, sustainable relationships with one another and the earth. You can find Kuni, a Japanese vision and practice for urban reconnection, on Amazon and other online booksellers. And you can also see Richard's site, which is thinklikepirates.com, to learn more about Kuni. Welcome to the show, Richard. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Mitch.
Well, I really enjoyed reading the book, but let me ask you to explain what Kuni is in a nutshell. What's involved in practicing this idea in today's society?
Well, Kuni is an individual story of a man in Japan who returned to a rural village and sought to reinvent the sense of place, reimagine the sense of place. And so in a way, it's a very rural story, but it is a strategy that I think is quite universal. Whether you live in a neighborhood, a town, a village, some forgotten place that is too small and vulnerable to survive, Kuni is a strategy to reimagine your place around its shared assets. To think of it almost to pretend as if you live in a small nation, and to rebuild the political, social, natural capital infrastructure that makes life worth living there. And I know that sounds kind of fanciful and vague
Sure.
at the same time, but in a nutshell, I'd say that's what it would be.
It's interesting because you use the phrase "too small to survive," but then it's a strategy for survival through reconnection, which also says that there is no isolated community. There's only communities within a community of communities.
Absolutely. And in fact, when I first met my co-author, Tsuyoshi-Sekihara, he talked about autonomy, which made me very excited. And I thought, no one's talking about autonomy. And I dug a little deeper. And I said, well, do you mean autonomy or do you mean interconnectedness?
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is maybe where self-reliance meets mutual aid in terms of these small communities, these villages, these rice-growing villages in Japan are very vulnerable. There are very few people there. They're starting to reach a tipping point of not being able to function. And so the first step was to develop measures that stabilize these places. And that stabilization, I think, is where you build a sense of autonomy, that we have to function and survive and rely on each other. And as he did in his early stages, especially rely on the volunteer capacity of the elderly in the community. So I agree with you. It's not autonomy as in separation and isolation, but to reinvent the sense of place so that it works for you who live there, and make it attractive to outsiders who are also trapped in their own realities and looking for a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, a sense of place, even if the repeat visitors who come from the outside really only visit or only sort of partially part of that community.
Visitors are an interesting component of this, but let's talk about where they come from, because Sekihara's vision or analysis of the city is deeply organic, and he sees them as large consuming organisms that just extract a toll. How does he think? Well, what's his idea? He uses a phrase, the new wildness that emerges in crowded cities. What does that mean?
I think he like most in Japan of his generation and really since abandoned the rural areas in order to extract a future in the cities. And when you extract a future, you are a consumer of that city, and therefore you lose a sense of civic engagement, responsibility for others. You are there to extract your living, your livelihood, your identity. And I think the wildness that concerns him in the city is that we become immune to others. We lose a sense of empathy, a sense of caring, connection. The very things that, of course, urbanites love about the city is we tell ourselves that civic life is real, and I love the close proximity to others. And I think what he began to feel as he pursued his professional career was that he felt less connected to others. And the lack of nature in the city desensitized him to a sense of order and rhythm and seasons and all the things that made him a whole human. And in his book, he describes a rather dystopian view of the city. And whenever he visits large cities, and he is, of course, talking about the mega cities, which is this whole culture of gigantism on our planet, where the cities just grow larger and larger and larger. And he refers to the cities whenever he visits them as a beast. And I have to admit, every time I see these strange steam emanating from the streets of Manhattan, I think of Sekihara and the beast and wonder maybe he's right.
Well, you use the word extract a living from in regards to living in a city, and then you refer to metrics and measurement in the small community, which of course creates accountability. We can all see what's going on, and we all owe something to one another. You sort of lose that in the city. Now,
I think it's that issue of scale and connectedness. And I mean, I know as someone who came from New Orleans and very active in rebuilding our food system and civic life in New Orleans, you, especially post-Hurricane Katrina, you began to become completely consumed with the idea of defending the place, that every decision you make has impact on the future viability of the place. I then moved to New York City, and I did feel very quickly like a cog in the wheel. It's a machine. It's an incredible machine, but it's one that can kick me out and spit me out at any moment, and no one would know that I was gone and that I was maybe even there to begin with.
Right.
I mean, it's a little extreme, but I think that's certainly what Sekihara felt and feels about the big cities.
And so he describes, or you do in one of the chapters, Kuni is an exchange economy that works as insurance, which of course suggests you don't just get kicked to the curb. You are still part of the community if you aren't part of the function that you used to occupy. How does that sense of economy as insurance manifest itself in a Kuni?
This is really one of the most interesting elements that really brought me in. And my contact with Japan through the Japan Society was through exchanges about disaster management. This was before their dreadful 3/11 disaster. But in Japan, you every day, every week are thinking about disaster, whether it's earthquake or tsunami or typhoon. it is so woven into the realm of weekly possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
I think in our political culture in North America, political cultures of North America, we really do not plan for disaster. We design, especially in the neoliberal model, we cut everything down to the bone so
Right.
that it is highly efficient. And when things go awry, we sort of seem surprised. In Japan, they're not surprised. You live in a large apartment building in Tokyo. Every month, you go through an exercise of disaster preparedness. You put on helmets. You have a counting, order of people showing up for this exercise. They take it very seriously. So it is part of people's bound. It's within the bounds of thinkable thought that things could go very badly.
Mm-hmm.
And so for the idea, and you're absolutely right about accountability. You live in a small community. The systems that deliver goods and services are much more human scaled. Therefore, if you have to say yes or no to someone, it is someone rather than some bureaucracy, and which is very appealing. This whole idea of what is the right size of a community to live in. But this idea of insurance that his village or collection of villages could provide an insurance plan or a program for outsiders, not just the insiders, but for the outsiders, is so interesting because they attract urban dwellers from as far away as Tokyo. That's like 4 hours from where their villages are in rural Joetsu. And when they come, they don't just come once. They begin to become almost honorary members of the community. They begin to
the visitor that you described earlier.
These are these repeat visitors who come, and they come looking for a sense of belonging, a sense of quiet, a sense of different kind of wildness, of walking in the forest, helping to clean the forests and thin them, begin to become the rhythm, begin to work their ways into the rhythm of these villages and village life, which is a very important part of, I think, Japanese national sort of identity. But where it becomes an insurance program is as consumers of the products of these villages, rice, tofu, and any of the products that they make there and they package beautifully. The transaction, which they refer to as the rice covenant, is not just a transaction of consumer and producer. It's a much deeper social contract of this covenant that you are now a member. We now treat you as and consider you as a member of our community. Of course, a community that desperately needs a population because they've lost so many people. And you can feel rest assured that you have a safe haven in this community should you need it. So should the tsunami, should an earthquake, any sort of natural disaster occur, you could find safe haven here and travel to this community. We will take you in. And this is kind of an extraordinary extension of the sense of what is our social contract, our obligations to one another, those who we live close to, as well as this vast distance of, 4 hours by train and by fast train in Japan, very, very far away. It begins to really tease out the idea of who are we accountable to? Who is our social obligation? Who does it include? What are the boundaries of this community? So it is this wonderful and I think really rather elegant tension between autonomy and interdependence. And of course it's around the idea of agritourism, which we think of in North America as a very straight commercial trajectory. And it is this political recognition of agritourism as something much more meaningful and deeper as a political project that excites me.
So entering Kuni, joining this community, is embracing shared stewardship of things that are related to the community. And Kuni, the way you describe it, has 12 core responsibilities to the participants that are enacted through what are called regional management organizations. So let me just ask about those 12 responsibilities. Can you summarize what a member can expect from the Kuni?
Well, And then maybe it's worth just quickly highlighting that Kuni is the ancient word in Japanese for the nation.
Right.
And it's a very old-fashioned term that is very rarely used. He reinvented it because he saw, well, no, it's not the nation. Maybe it is our community, and the idea of community as inclusive, as pluralist, and that a community needs to be served by some kind of institution, whether it's local government, national government, because local government had failed so dreadfully. As the sort of rot sets in and all the energy in Japan moved to the city and left rural communities to rot, he developed what he calls a regional management organization, which is a nonprofit intermediary in our kind of terminology, a nonprofit intermediary that provides community development and economic development, and I'd say also political leadership to manage that community. And by that community, and this is what's rather creative and not backward looking, but forward looking, is he's aggregating villages, some of which have literally fallen apart, others which are holding on, and bypassed, rather than taking on the political leadership of the mayor. And the village mayor is, ceremonial and a real political power, but it's become a shell. And by aggregating the interests of 10, 15, 20 villages within a region and put them under a aggregated leadership, nonprofit leadership, what you end up doing is replacing local government as a nonprofit entity that is engaged with providing economic livelihood, which would be, of the 12 services it provides, it's transportation for the elderly, social services for the elderly, education and after-school programs for the young, in addition to the schools that may still exist. Economic development, so coordinating the production and marketing and sales of products that aggregate different farmers' lands and goods. In essence, it's and it sounds almost utopian, except that that's also what I love about his approach and why I thought it was worth sharing, is that it's very pragmatic. It's not ideological. He's not trying to create a utopian society, though I think he's inspired by that as I am. But he's beginning to develop a strategy that is like a parallel reality to the existing failing, fading political system that no longer serves regional, rural areas that are still so important because they possess assets that are cultural, spiritual, natural, and architectural. They have these incredibly beautiful 200-year-old farmhouses that have just been left to rot. So they've been rehabbing them and redesigning them and
turning them into lodges and so forth, not just
And it really, it's a phenomenon also that I've seen in other places, small rural places, is developing them into museums of that place, low-tech museums, just vestiges of life as it once was. Because barring that, I think we simply do forget. And so whether it's how they used to make boots out of the straw of rice, and how they were so logical and beautiful. So there's this wonderful recognition of traditional arts and beauty that came with traditional crafts, but then very forward-looking. Let's invent a new economic, political structure for our lives.
Well, that made a connection for me, because you also talk about the role of the fan club, which I found an odd idea until just a moment ago. But what you're really talking about is becoming a fan of our heritage.
Yeah.
And beginning to appreciate it again, rather than seeing it as something we just threw away or we can't learn from. So when you talk about a fan club, what is the role of fandom? I had thought it might be kind of similar to committing to buy your produce from a CSA here in the United States, but it's more. How would you describe that?
It is more, I love the fan club. And I have to say, what I love about it is it usually makes me smile, if not snicker, when I think about it. It's very light. It's very approachable. It's also everywhere in Japan. And it's the sort of almost technicolor surrealism that is life in Japan that I find so contrasts so sharply with our lives, which is why I find we can learn from it because we're so different, just as they love to learn from us. Everyone has a fan club, a corporation, a baseball team, a village. It's part of the imagination in Japan. So the idea of a fan club for them is not so strange. But what is so exciting about it is that it is a very light and happy way to engage. And I know from having run membership organizations, it's very hard. Do people really want to be a member of something? The social capital that people want, and I think increasingly want, has to be light and fluid. And I can lean forward when I want to lean forward, and I can lean back when I don't want that tight social, connection. And the idea of being a member of a fan club, so being a consumer, yes, with a loyalty scheme like any retailer would have, it's aligned with that. Mm-hmm. But it's much more than that. And I think you really honed in on it. It's being a fan of a place, being a fan of a way of life, of traditions that don't seem to be celebrated elsewhere. And so it elevates these core assets is something that you can participate in. But it's not doctrinaire that, right. you have to, you have to clean out the irrigation canals. But if you are a fan of this, you'll discover the joys of being responsible for the management of the ecosystem.
And with others.
And with others. And that is, I think, probably the most important thing, because his life in Tokyo, where he lived and was very successful in design work, but then hit a crisis. It was during the crisis and the economic collapse of what he was doing, and he felt he was a failure. He felt very alone. And it was returning, not home, but someplace near home and like home, into a small rural village where he realized several things. One, that it is beautiful. And when you live in the city, you forget natural beauty, by and large. He also realized that the beauty of the rural areas doesn't just happen. It has to be maintained. And he saw what were the effects of deferred maintenance and the rust that was setting in, and that by organizing, as the strange outsider who was familiar but different to them, he organized volunteer cleaning out of the irrigation canals, the thinning of the forest, and he discovered the sense of camaraderie. And it is that social isolation that is the rot for living in a healthy community, for democracy, for all of the things that we know make us happy. And yet we found it so difficult to find the pathways into meaningful connection with others, close proximity with others. Mm-hmm. And I think to a certain extent, it comes from escaping from your everyday life. So if you live in the city, it may take you traveling to a rural community that appears to be functioning for you to return back to your community in the city and discover, I don't live in a city. I live in a small corner of a neighborhood within a city. And as we begin to clarify those moving parts, maybe we can begin to find the ways in which we plug into those places and rediscover our proximity and our avenues for engagement.
There is so much to unpack here. I just want to take a quick commercial break, and we're going to be right back to continue the discussion. And we're back to continue the conversation with Richard McCarthy. He is co-author of Kuni, a Japanese vision and practice for urban-rural reconnection, which he wrote with Tsuyoshi-Sekihara. So, following on what you were talking about just a moment ago with regard to these sort of the invention of a shared community that we enter in Kuni, I'm thinking about what has happened over the course of the last 20 to 30 years because of the internet and the emergence of what was celebrated as tribes who have, shared interests. They love yoga. They love a baseball team. They love, or they have an identity, racial, cultural, ethnic, whatever it may be, that they all connect virtually around. And that has become a source of a lot of division as well as a lot of shared emerging identity. How can we use the ideas of Kuni, the shared responsibility, not just the shared identity, to reconnect those groups so that we don't have conflict all the time?
Mitch, what you described is, in many ways, the allure of this strange 21st century period where, with globalization, with the proliferation of technology, place becomes secondary to our other interests. And I do think some of these other interests are fascinating bridges. If you are a Corvette car obsessive, you can find your tribe. And you can find them online. You can go to events and share in the joys of the combustion engine and design. I find that very exciting because you do overcome some of the barriers that otherwise divide us. Class, race, doesn't matter. If you love this car, then you're in the tribe. And that's the bonding that also occurs with the bridging. But it's this tension between bonding and bridging that I think is so interesting. And it's what brought me to food. And I sort of fell into food as an organizing tool many, many years ago, in part because what I saw was the opportunity to overcome the barriers. Because food is, especially when you grow up in New Orleans, food is the ultimate discussion. So people have an opinion about it. They care about it. They also care about the details, and the details come back to the ingredients, and the ingredients come back to the farmers and who grows it and where does it come from. And so we found a sort of wormhole in the universe between urban and rural, producer and consumer. And this is what brought me to farmers markets. But even that is very transactional. It's, I like your products. I don't have to know anything about you, but I like your products. What does happen over time is you begin to develop a real relationship, but it's on your terms in the city. The farmer comes to the city. What really excited me when I visited the villages in Japan that Sekihara has organized was not only how beautiful they were, how happy people seemed to be, but I was going to them. It wasn't always you have to come to the city. So it is this desire to promote rural that does excite me, because rural places shouldn't just be places of production. They should be places that are communities. And I think that place is an organizing tool as well, but it requires people to travel across bridges. And so we have to find what are the avenues or the gateways to those bridges, because you're absolutely right. We can carve out our own little tribe and never have to deal with the person we're living next to because they're not in my digital community.
Well, and the digital era populism that really is a plague in a lot of ways is oriented around grievance rather than responsibility. And that grievance is often magnified by the fact that you really get a sense that there is no bridge between the city and the rural community. The other thing that Kuni bridges is a generational divide, valuing elders and their insights and the connection between youth and older folks. Why is that multi-generational perspective particularly important to taking the step back to true shared responsibility?
Well, I think in Japan, we have a lot to learn from how far along they are in the aging problem of the country. And unfortunately, we look at it as a problem as well. We don't look to elders as keepers of wisdom, of a wormhole to another age that may possess tools, skills that have useful value for our future. So I think it is something that we can learn from because the Japanese do revere the elderly. Whereas we look at them as just in the way. We need to see the transfer of wealth go to the next generation.
An expense.
Yeah, and as an expense. That's absolutely correct. And I think we do that by honoring the skills that they possess. And I've noted that it is in particular the interaction between the young and the old, and that is at the center of the Kuni work, so that the young, who of course cannot wait to get out of the rural village, they want to escape and never return. The education that they provide in the community is they encourage people to leave. They want young people to go and get educated. But in order to do that, they also have to equip them with enough pride and knowledge about how special their place is on the planet. And when I think of, most people, unless you live in like the epicenter, mega city, hipster places, you feel pretty low about where you live because it doesn't possess all of the bells and whistles that media, society, prevailing wisdom
that you see on TV and the internet.
Yeah, is of value. And so they spend a great deal of time organizing activities between the elderly and the young around sharing some of the traditional knowledge about the forests, about native plants, about wild food, about hunting, about raising chickens. I mean, you name it. And I think it creates a sense of pride among the young that they don't live in a barren wasteland. They actually live in a very important village that has continuity, that possesses assets, so that when they leave, they also leave with the idea of returning home and to bring back the knowledge of the outside world back to the villages. And I would say that the agricultural businesses that they now run with the rice and the all the value-added products that they raise and the seaweed and so forth are now packaged and marketed using technology. And the young are starting to play that role. The young are beginning to see their potential for leadership because the old avenues for becoming a leader in that community had become moribund. And the village mayors were holding on to their power because what else could they do? And by creating this RMO, you begin to create the conditions for Kuni, for community, a healthy community, by creating new channels for leadership development. And the leadership development is being a tour guide for when the repeat visitors come. The young are showing the older or middle-aged visitors how this village works.
And allows them to express their pride.
It does. It does. So it's a very practical, approach in that regard. And I think it's also important that one of the reasons why people in, small, isolated rural areas can't wait to leave is they want the razzle dazzle of the city, entertainment, culture. One of the things they have organized are bringing to the rural village musical performances from really top-notch performers from Tokyo, from Kyoto, from other culture centers in Japan, so that it's not an either or, that you have to live in the city to enjoy culture. Culture can come to you, high culture, performance, entertainment. And so it is this exchange. And I think it's one of the questions you asked at the beginning about this sort of autonomy. It's not isolation, it's exchange. And it is this exchange that excites me as someone who's almost always lived in the city and reached out to rural, is to learn from the rural point of view of what does that exchange look like on the other end. And as a result, I think what we end up creating is this strange kind of place polygamy. And it's a place polygamy that we understand on the internet because it doesn't matter where you are. But this strange notion that you can live in the city but spend much of your week thinking about and caring about the rural community that you are invested in. And again, not as a kind of affluent second home owner kind of way, but you can just be an office worker and find meaning by connecting to, these villages and this political project. I find that very inspiring because I think we need to find fluid ways that make those exchanges much more common and natural and frequent.
Well, this also raises a question. We're talking about what is essentially a restorative program for places that exist already. Could you create Kuni around a new community or a new place? And what would be involved in doing that?
I think absolutely. And in fact, when I first encountered him, I immediately went to the anthropologist Benedict Anderson's book, Imagined Communities, which is his definition of what a nation is. A nation is essentially an imagined community because you'll never meet everyone in the nation. You just have this idea that you are part of something together with others. I think we can do that in neighborhoods. I think we can do it in new communities. We do certainly see transition towns and intentional communities being established. The problem with them, always seems to me, is that it requires such an intense commitment to that place. And it's certainly much harder to say, it's quite a leap of faith that I'm going to abandon everything and become part of this new intentional imagined community. And it's high risk. Not everyone's up for that high risk. On the other hand, cities in particular, and big and small, often are under this exercise to brand a neighborhood and often rebrand a neighborhood. Sometimes it's out of desires for gentrification. Sometimes it's to eliminate past racist identifications of a place, or, it's for a variety of reasons. But it does go to show that this is all a very creative process. We can invent and reinvent places. And if you say it's a place and you define the boundaries of that place, and it makes, especially if it makes some sense, like it fits into some kind of bioregional boundaries, that this is a place, well, then all you have to do is begin to map the assets of that place. Commercial assets, shared public assets, churches, places of faith, whatever.
Or to your earlier comment, the opportunity to create agritourism.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And then that becomes a place that you have an identity with. It's a place that you feel committed to. And it's not some vague concept of a large nation somewhere that may or may not mean anything to you. It's the place that you inhabit. It's the place that you interact with on a regular basis. I spent a great deal of time in where I am right now in the Finger Lakes of New York. Well, it's not a political boundary, but it is a bioregional place identified by a number of glacial lakes that for many people describes that I live in that place. And so it's a subnational identity. And I think we can go very, very small to the micro neighborhood and think about the economy of that place. How do we spend money in that place? Do we spend it with local sources? How do the money transactions does it recirculate those monies or not? It can also be, you can move back out of the map and actually look at a region that involves several towns and cities and counties and so forth. I think in a way that the great gift and scourge of technology is that it has somewhat freed us from the narrow constraints that we must accept the political boundaries that we live in. Yeah. And it's now is a time to imagine new ones and rebrand your place and not rebrand it in a kind of crass commercial way, though, that is certainly part of the picture, but to actually rebrand it as a place that I have a social and economic and political obligation to, i.e. my neighbors. it's very old-fashioned, and it's also quite radical. And I think it's this strange match of very traditional ideas about community responsibility and the role between the individual and the community, as well as a very forward-looking idea that, maybe the political boundaries that we've invented and that we've accepted no longer jibe that closely with the life I want to lead.
Well, they've become arbitrary. And that also raises another important point about when we talk about this as old-fashioned and traditional and so forth, it isn't worship of the ancient. It's still an evolving community based on what I read. And there was a really interesting example of this. So the Japanese drive on the left side of the road because during the Edo period, when the samurai were walking these roads, they carried their swords on the right-hand side. In other words, on the side that the person coming at you would be on. And now we drive that way in Japan. But that is an arbitrary thing. And recognizing that it was arbitrary and may no longer be even applicable is also a function of Kuni, as I read it.
Absolutely. I mean, the cultural hangover of things that we do because, well, it's tradition, or tradition is based on something very logical. Well, what was logical 200 years ago, 300 years ago, is not necessarily logical today. Mm-hmm. And how we lock ourselves into that straitjacket speaks to a lack of courage, maybe a lack of political imagination. And that was what I really admire about Sekihara, to go to the village mayors. And at first he went to them for permission. And then he realized, I don't have to ask them for permission. Mm-hmm. I will just do this. I will not undermine them or challenge them. I will just create a parallel reality. And, it may be something very different to decide whether you're going to drive on the left or right-hand side. I mean, you can do it arbitrarily yourself, but you may run into problems because of just the orderly flow of
oncoming traffic problem. Yeah.
Oncoming traffic problem. But for things that we do have the flexibility to change, let's change them. And I think also this issue of scale. I having run non-governmental organizations and often encountered this classic default phrase of scaling up. Mm-hmm. I've become just very suspicious of it because I think it is it's something that we tell ourselves that, oh yeah, unless it scales up, it's not relevant. Well, maybe we shouldn't be scaling up. Maybe we should be replicating
or subdividing.
Yeah, and it speaks to like the driving on the left in Japan, which I originally thought must have had something to do with the British because there's so many similarities between Britain and Japan. But no, it had nothing to do with it, which was a real eye-opener. Is that if we just scale up because that's what all the grants say, that's what the government programs say, well, then you get what you get. But if we really ask, what is the scale of life that we want to live in that gives us a sense of meaning, with which we have maybe not the strong social ties, but the loose social ties that give us a sense of connectedness and belonging, we might be happier.
Well, the last thing I want to touch on is throughout the book, there's a deep thread involving equality. And when we talk about scaling up, a lot of that is an excuse to say this is so large that the individual can't matter or have impact. But that's when you want to recut the political and other boundaries in order to restore the accountability and an agency of participants. So how does Kuni suggest a solution to recognizing the inherent equality of every person? And what do you do in your life to reinforce equality in your work?
Yeah, that is a real challenge with like efficiency. Efficiency and scale is we love those two things, so we got to trade them off. And I'm less and less inspired by things that are efficient, because maybe they just need to be sufficiently efficient in order to function. But I think a great example of it in our just everyday lives is the self checkout line. It's more efficient. Well, really? I actually don't find it that efficient. And it also removes one, maybe not great social interaction, but it is a social interaction in our daily lives. And it provides employment.
There is actually an example of that I read about just this week. And I can't remember the grocery chain, but they've introduced slow checkout lines, and they've really done it. Not to use
I think it's in the Netherlands.
Yeah. But it allows people to have the chat, and that is bringing people back, and they're spending more. So it's just rethinking boundaries. It's not rethinking authority.
Exactly. And I think this is the issue of authority. And I would say that some of my first harder conversations with Sekihara, when we met and when we discussed these issues that led to the book, I wasn't sure where he stood on the questions of authority and hierarchy. The Japanese are very they're very collective in their behavior. Fishermen, for instance, cannot sell products directly. That has to go through the co-op. That they are very communitarian in their approach. But there's also an extraordinary high respect for hierarchy and authority. And I wasn't sure where this was going. It easily could go in a territory that makes me feel less comfortable. And I found, actually, I was greatly relieved that he was not interested in high levels of authority. He wants to see power distributed. But there does need to be some entity who manages things, which is why the regional management organization. And I think he's right. I think we shouldn't be terrified of a certain degree of professionalism and management, but it has to be held accountable. And so it's held accountable because there is the vote and the advisory, the board for the RMO, and the manager can be dismissed, and so there is accountability. I think in my work, most of my work has been in food systems, and especially retail and farmers markets. I believe very strongly that, and it may sound sort of goofy, but farmers markets shouldn't have an apostrophe in the S. I don't think they belong to the farmers. It's not like the farmers market. It is a market of farmers, and it should be managed by some intermediary who has no axe to grind in terms of how you balance competition and cooperation, because the market has to operate as a market for the good of the market, for the good of the consumer, the producer, and the community that hosts that neighborhood, physical space. And it requires that intermediary to make professional decisions. So there is, in some regards, an independence or an entity that has a hierarchical role, but they are accountable. Yep. And I think more often than not, the best check is not just how is it structured with decision making and accountability and being able to have a vote, but also by scale. If it's small, what can go wrong can only go so wrong at a certain scale of bad news. Yeah. And as you begin to become larger, you begin to make those trade-offs, and the distance between those who govern and those who are governed grows. And it's that distance that creates cynicism and a disregard for the effects or the ramifications of your decision making when you do have some power.
There is so much in this book. I hope that folks will take the time to read and contemplate it. Richard, I want to thank you for taking time to talk with us today, but are you going to be doing readings and community discussions to support the book? And how can our listeners get involved and learn more about Kuni?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. I am doing readings. In fact, I think my first physical in-person reading will be in something of a rural retreat in Western Massachusetts at the end of April. I'm just beginning to sort of thaw and organize trips around the country, not just, this sort of wonderful placeless digital conversation. I have a blog that is called Think Like Pirates, and I post events and speaking and information about Kuni on there. So thinklikepirates.com is a great place to turn to for where these events will take place.
Thank you very much, Richard. You have a great day.
Thank you, Mitch.
We've been speaking with Richard McCarthy. He's the co-author with Tsuyoshi-Sekihara of Kuni, a Japanese vision and practice for urban-rural reconnection. You can find the book on Amazon, Barnes&Noble, and .com, but we haven't found it at any local bookstore, so can't point to any. Kuni is a fascinating practice to think about as we transition from one form of energy to another, because everything can be redesigned as we rethink how we power our lives and lifestyles. Richard touched on the idea of, let me paraphrase, appropriate efficiency, and how large-scale projects may become dehumanizing when they overflow the settings and habits in which we live. That highlights the fact that the sustainable economy that we want to see take hold will take long, slow work involving a lot of renegotiation of human and economic relationships. It's not sexy work, but it's incredibly important work that requires patience and an open mind. Check out Richard's site, thinklikepirates.com, to dig into how you might use Kuni principles in your community and business, and do take the time to read the book. It's certainly worthwhile. Folks, would you take a few minutes to share this show or any of the more than 360 episodes of Sustainability in Your Ear that we've already produced with your friends, family, neighbors, and coworkers? You all are the amplifiers that spread the ideas that can lead to a less wasteful world. Let folks know they can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, or any of the other fine purveyors of podcast goodness. We will really appreciate your support. And thank you for doing this at the beginning of the year. 2023 is going to be a pivotal one for sustainability. Please help us spread the word. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. We'll be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.